They said the hills kept their own time. They said the soil remembered what people tried to bury. And they said that in the winter of 1834, something stirred beneath both. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. What I'm about to read comes from a locked folio found in a courthouse attic in Southern Virginia. The pages were preserved by accident, pressed between land surveys and mildew, stained birth ledgers. Most entries are written in a narrow, disciplined hand. But the first page is rough, almost frantic, as if the writer couldn't steady himself enough to decide whether he wanted this documented at all. The record centers on a girl named Eliza Carver, age 17, who arrived at the county infirmary late one night after collapsing at the threshold. Her dress was soaked through with cold sweat, and her pulse fluttered like something trying to escape. No one knew where she had come from. No one knew who her people were, and the midwife on duty, Mrs. Constance Red, noted that the girl seemed confused by her own condition. Eliza was pregnant, far along, yet she insisted she had never been touched by a man. In 1834, such claims weren't unheard of, but the attending physician, Dr. Nathaniel Price, wrote that Eliza's confusion wasn't the usual shame or denial he'd seen from farm girls hiding trouble. She behaved as if someone had erased half her memories. She couldn't recall the previous 6 months. She couldn't recall travel or family, or even what season it had been when she last felt well. What she did repeat, over and over, was a single name Dr. Price couldn't trace in any local registry: the Marrowfield folk. Price suspected fever hallucinations. The Carvers were an isolated clan scattered across the ridges north of the river, and their name tended to surface only during tax disputes or boundary arguments. Still, he'd never heard of any Marrowfield. He assumed the girl had come from a remote cabin and had simply forgotten her surname. What unsettled him more was the condition of her body. According to the medical notes preserved in the folio, Eliza's abdomen was swollen in an odd, uneven way that didn't match a normal pregnancy. The shape of it shifted subtly from hour to hour, almost migrating under the skin. Mrs. Red tried to reassure the girl. She prepared broth. She wiped her brow with cool cloths. But Eliza's responses grew stranger. She kept turning her head as if listening to something just outside the infirmary wall, something too faint for anyone else to hear. At one point she sat up straight and whispered, "They're asking if I made it." When Mrs. Red pressed her, who was asking, Eliza blinked and said she didn't know. Dr. Price closed the entry with a note of irritation. He described the girl as exhausted, malnourished, and possibly delirious from poor diet and stress. His recommendation was bed rest and continued observation. But beneath that, written in smaller, tighter script, he added a more cautious line. He warned that the girl must not be left unattended at night, not because she posed danger, but because the infirmary itself had begun to feel charged with some influence that produced unease in the staff. The next paragraph is dated 2 days later. Price explains that the girl had been asleep most of the preceding night, yet the staff reported hearing soft pacing in the corridor outside her room. When they checked, the corridor was empty. The pacing continued until dawn. Floorboards creaked, lamps flickered, and every few minutes, Eliza shifted in her sleep as if responding to someone calling her name. On the morning of January 12th, the folio notes a discovery that made Dr. Price lose his composure for the first time since his training in Richmond. Eliza woke with bruises around her ribs. Not finger-shaped, not hand-shaped. They curved across her skin in patterns resembling loops or arcs, faint but perfectly symmetrical on either side. Price examined the marks and recorded that they looked like pressure stains, formed from inside the womb rather than outside. His exact phrasing: "The girl bears the imprint of something that does not match the anatomy of any child I have delivered." He ordered complete confinement for her safety. Throughout that day, the staff took turns watching her. She spoke little, though she occasionally murmured phrases about the line continuing and the shape being almost complete. Each time she said those things, her pulse steadied, as if whatever troubled her was also somehow comforting. By sundown, Price had drafted a telegram to a former colleague with an interest in malformed births. hoping for guidance. He never sent it. Before he could, Eliza experienced the first episode the folio calls the alignment. Her abdomen hardened and rose sharply toward her ribs. Her breathing slowed, her eyes fixed on the rafters as if she recognized a pattern in the beams that no one else could see. And from somewhere inside her, faint but unmistakable, came a series of soft clicks. Not bone, not movement, something more deliberate. Eliza did not scream. She only whispered, "It knows I am here." The morning after the alignment, the infirmary seemed smaller. The walls leaned closer, and the shadows clung to corners as if they had weight. Eliza Carver sat on the edge of her cot, her hands pressed to her swollen belly, whispering in a language no one recognized. Dr. Price noted it carefully, recording that the syllables were neither English nor any dialect he had studied. Yet there was rhythm and intention in them, a cadence that suggested memory or command rather than random noise. By noon, her condition had worsened. Her abdomen shifted again, subtly, almost imperceptibly to the untrained eye, but the infirmary staff swore they could see small movements under the skin that didn't correspond to normal fetal activity. Mrs. Red, pale and shaken, confessed that she had never witnessed anything like it, not even in the most deformed births she had attended. Eliza's speech became fragmented, interspersed with murmurs about ancestors and continuity. "They say the line must not break," she said, voice trembling. The shape demands it." Price recorded the words verbatim, but neither he nor the nurses could divine their meaning. Attempts to question her were met with silence, or eyes that darted to points in the room that were empty. That evening, a visiting physician, Dr. Henry Ashcroft from the county seat, arrived at Price's request. Ashcroft had experience with rare congenital conditions and was curious about the girl. When he examined Eliza, he found that her pulse was irregular, sometimes fluttering wildly, sometimes slowing to the point of near arrest. Her temperature fluctuated by degrees that suggested no known infection. He noted dark veins visible beneath the surface of her skin, pulsing in a rhythm entirely unlike a normal circulatory pattern. Dr. Ashcroft wrote in his notes that he had never seen a human form adapt so rapidly to what could only be described as an internal directive, as if the body was learning to contain something alien within it. Price added in the margin, in smaller handwriting, "I begin to fear she carries not a child, but an inheritance." That night, Eliza awoke the staff again. They heard the soft clicks and murmurs from her room, but this time they were accompanied by a low, vibrating hum that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The midwife and nurses described the sound as a resonance, almost musical, yet deeply disturbing, like a forgotten lullaby that reminded the listener of mortality. Mrs. Red recounted a conversation with Eliza during a moment of lucidity. The girl described a family history that had never been recorded in any ledger, clans isolated in the hollers, intermarriage spanning generations, children whose bodies folded in on themselves to achieve what the elders called perfection. According to Eliza, the Carver line had long been obsessed with continuity and unbroken succession. Marriages between siblings, cousins, and uncles had not been rare, they were expected. The goal, she said, was not wealth or land, but something the family called the full circle, a state where the body itself could bear the weight of its own design. Over the next 3 days, the girl's belly grew with alarming speed. By the 4th day, it had begun to harden into unusual contours, forming sharp angles and raised ridges that did not correspond to any known anatomy. Dr. Ashcroft and Dr. Price were baffled, recording diagrams and sketches, trying to understand the shapes forming beneath the skin. Price noted that the fetus, or whatever was within, did not behave like a separate entity. Instead, it seemed to dictate the very physiology of the mother, manipulating organs and limbs with intent. Medical journals from neighboring counties described the Carvers a strange reputation. Midwives whispered of children born with limbs fused in grotesque angles, heads elongated or flattened, eyes misaligned, and skin mottled like aged parchment. Entire households were reportedly abandoned due to the stigma and fear surrounding these births. Yet the Carvers themselves saw these traits as signs of advancement, proof that the line was approaching the mysterious ideal they called the complete form. Late on the fifth night, Eliza experienced another episode. Her pulse slowed to near cessation, and yet the vibrations under her skin intensified. Price described the phenomenon as the body orchestrating itself to the will of the unborn. The staff watched in helpless fascination as her abdomen shifted in undulating patterns, raising the hairs on their arms and making them feel as though they were witnessing not a birth, but a ritual. It was during this night that the first tangible evidence of the Carver family's twisted tradition emerged. Eliza murmured the names of her relatives, men and women long dead, interred in shallow graves on the ridges, and described the order in which children had been paired and birthed. She spoke of rotations, of cycles repeated over decades, and of the deliberate merging of bloodlines. Ashcroft's notes reflect disbelief, yet a grim understanding seeped in. This was not random. This was a program, a calculated succession, carried over generations with precision. By dawn the girl was exhausted, yet alert enough to watch the staff with a faint, knowing smile. The air of the infirmary had grown oppressive. No one dared speak above a whisper. Even the animals outside the windows were restless. Price scribbled his final observation of the night. "I fear that what she carries is not merely human. We may be witnesses to the culmination of centuries of devotion to a principle beyond morality, beyond comprehension. I do not know if it will live. I do not know if it should." By the morning of January 18, 1834, the infirmary had become a place of quiet dread. Eliza Carver lay on the narrow cot, pale and trembling, her hands pressed firmly to her protruding abdomen. Dr. Price and Dr. Ashcroft had taken turns keeping watch, their observations increasingly bordering on disbelief. Every hour brought new distortions. Her skin rippled as though something beneath were rearranging itself, and the dark veins visible beneath the surface had begun to twist in spiral formations. Eliza's speech had slowed, but when she murmured, she spoke of the family line with a clarity that was unnerving. The sequence must remain unbroken, she whispered one night, her voice low and urgent. Every rotation, every union, all converge here. It must be complete. Neither Price nor Ashcroft could interpret the significance of her words, but the intensity of her conviction unsettled them more than the physical anomalies. The midwife, Mrs. Red, described the girl's behavior as increasingly ritualistic. She would clasp her hands and bow her head for hours, murmuring in a tongue none could recognize, or staring at the ceiling, eyes wide, as though following invisible patterns. Sometimes she shivered violently, yet remained entirely conscious, and often her limbs would twitch in precise, deliberate motions as though obeying instructions from inside her body. Dr. Ashcroft began recording meticulous notes, comparing these observations to every congenital anomaly he had ever encountered. But nothing prepared him for what he witnessed on the morning of the sixth day. Eliza's abdomen had taken on an unnatural, asymmetrical contour, with bulges forming at angles that no standard anatomical diagram could account for. The fetus, or whatever inhabited her womb, was no longer contained within expected limits. Her belly moved almost independently, curling slightly, then relaxing, in a rhythm that resembled a silent heartbeat, though nothing on the monitors corresponded. That day, a nurse reported seeing the shadows in the infirmary stretch and bend in ways that echoed the undulations of Eliza's abdomen. Staff members described a sensation of being watched, not by the girl, but by something emanating from within her. Price wrote in his journal that he felt as though the room itself had become aware of the presence, leaning in to observe their reactions. Eliza spoke less frequently now, but when she did, her voice carried an eerie calmness. "The ancestors are satisfied. They see it unfolding. The line will continue," she said almost reverently. Price noted in the margin that he believed the girl was not simply relaying family tradition, but somehow sensing the culmination of a process, one carried across generations with deliberate precision. Over the next 24 hours, her body continued to defy medical understanding. Veins writhed beneath the surface like living script, and small lumps shifted positions as though organs and skeletal structures were rearranging themselves. Ashcroft speculated that this could be a form of extreme inbreeding amplified over generations, a physiological manifestation of centuries of concentrated bloodlines. But even he admitted that nothing in medical literature suggested that inbreeding alone could produce these effects. The folio makes special note of the family's history at this point. The Carvers were known in their isolated ridge community for centuries of intermarriage. Records indicate that siblings, cousins, and even uncles had united in controlled sequences meant to consolidate what they called genetic harmony. The goal, according to the girl, was to produce a body that could bear the weight of the entire lineage, the complete form, without reference to conventional human limitations. Dr. Price and Ashcroft observed that the girl seemed to respond to invisible cues, her body twitching or contracting, as though following instructions from something she could not see. Sometimes her limbs would bend in impossible angles, fingers curling into spirals, toes fusing and then separating in the span of minutes. Ashcroft remarked privately that he had never seen a human body adapt in such an active, dynamic way while still maintaining basic vital functions. Late that evening, Eliza whispered something that would later haunt the attending staff. "It listens," she said, eyes darting toward the corner of the room. "It knows who watches. It chooses." Price and Ashcroft were too exhausted to question her further, but they recorded the statement verbatim, noting that it seemed less a confession than a warning. By the next morning, her abdomen had hardened into a grotesque, bulbous formation. Veins formed thick, winding networks visible through translucent skin. Ashcroft sketched the patterns, describing them as geometric, almost algorithmic, with symmetry that suggested intentional design. Price added in his notes that he suspected these formations mirrored the rotations and unions of generations past. Physical echoes of the family's centuries. Long breeding system, the nurses whispered among themselves, uneasy at the girl's stillness. They swore that the hum of her abdomen sounded like faint chanting, rising and falling in a cadence that no human could produce. Mrs. Red insisted that she had seen Eliza's body lift, slightly above the cot for brief moments, as though some unseen force guided her motions. Ashcroft's scientific skepticism warred with what he saw. Even Price, a man of rational mind, admitted that he had begun to consider the possibility that they were witnessing not a normal birth, but the culmination of a deliberately cultivated family line, executed over decades to produce something beyond human comprehension. The folio closes this segment with a single note. She is not merely pregnant, she carries the weight of centuries. The line converges here. We are observers to a design we cannot understand. By January 20, 1834, Eliza Carver's condition had entered a stage no physician could anticipate. The rhythmic pulsing beneath her skin intensified, and her body appeared to act independently of her conscious will. Dr. Price and Dr. Ashcroft had begun to treat the situation not only as a medical emergency, but as a phenomenon they could scarcely classify. Each movement, each distortion of her body, suggested a pattern, a sequence executed with meticulous intent. The child within, they suspected, was no ordinary fetus. Price wrote in his notes that it exhibited autonomous control over the maternal body. "It bends, it folds, it commands," he scrawled in trembling handwriting. "We are witnessing a collaboration, not simply development." Ashcroft agreed silently, his eyes reflecting exhaustion and growing unease. The veins across her abdomen had darkened to a deep purple, spiraling and intersecting like the carved lines of an ancient manuscript. Shadows in the infirmary seemed to bend and lengthen, reacting to each subtle contraction, giving the impression that the room itself was aware. Mrs. Red whispered that the Carvers had long believed in a concept called the perfect circle, a generational design that was now manifesting in real time. The girl murmured fragments of their creed. The rotations must align. Blood obeys. Flesh completes. Price shivered at the words, noting that they were repeated in the exact cadence described in earlier family journals from their isolated ridge. Ashcroft checked his ledger obsessively. The records corroborated what Eliza had said. The line of the Carvers had been carefully orchestrated for over a century, ensuring that blood remained concentrated, producing bodies that diverged from human norms with each successive generation. Elisa's face changed as well. Her eyes, once a muted brown, had shifted to a pale yellow, almost luminescent in the dim candlelight of the infirmary. Her lips twitched in expressions that did not correspond to thought or pain, but seemed directed towards some unseen presence. Occasionally she would tilt her head, listening to something beyond human perception, then whisper names of relatives who had been dead for decades. "They watch. They wait. They approve," she said quietly. The medical staff were unsettled not only by what they saw but by what they felt. The air in the room seemed charged, heavy, vibrating with a resonance that none could measure but all could feel. Ashcroft noted in his journal that the hum seemed to synchronize with the pulsing veins, suggesting a kind of physiological music, a rhythm dictated by the unseen intelligence within the womb. On the morning of the 7th day, Elisa awoke briefly, aware and coherent for the first time since her fevered decline. She gestured toward the cot where Price had set up his instruments, scribbling diagrams, and murmured a warning. "The culmination is near. Do not interfere. You cannot understand." Her tone was calm, almost serene, yet carried a gravity that froze the staff in place. Ashcroft later recalled feeling as though the girl were speaking not as a mother, but as a vessel for some centuries-old mandate. Throughout that day, her body continued to defy expectations. Limbs contorted in ways that violated anatomical convention, fingers formed spirals, toes fused, and the abdomen shifted subtly, responding to invisible cues. Price noted that the child's movements within seemed intelligent, deliberate. Unlike ordinary fetuses, which react reflexively, this entity adjusted, adapted, and manipulated the maternal form with precision that implied cognition. The Carver family's philosophy of selective breeding became evident in these observations. Ashcroft Cross referenced the murmured names, rotations, and unions with the family records he had obtained from distant relatives in the ridge. He documented a terrifying pattern. Each child had been born according to an exact rotation schedule, ensuring the concentration of bloodlines to levels that defied biological norms. The child within Elisa represented the apex of this long-running system, a culmination of calculated unions and generations of preserved blood. Even the hospital staff began to notice subtle reactions beyond the girl herself. The faint sounds, clicks, hums, vibrations, seemed to emanate from her abdomen, reverberating through the wooden floors, disturbing instruments and linens. Shadows flickered at impossible angles, and the room itself felt alive with presence. Price, normally a man of calm observation, confided to Ashcroft that he felt they were witnessing not a medical case, but a revelation of a family's centuries-old obsession realized in physical form. By nightfall, the atmosphere had grown oppressive. Elisa's breathing was uneven, yet she remained astonishingly resilient. The veins on her abdomen wreathed in mesmerizing, almost hypnotic patterns, while her murmurs grew more fervent, naming ancestors, reciting sequences, confirming the rotations of generations. Ashcroft wrote in his journal that he felt as though the girl were a conduit through which the Carver lineage itself had manifested. A living testament to the extremes of hereditary obsession. Price's final note of the day was stark. "We observe the edge of human possibility, the endpoint of centuries of intent. This child may defy life, yet it is alive. It is more than human, and we are powerless to alter its course. The line converges here, and we are witnesses to its culmination." By January 21, 1834, the dynamics of the infirmary had changed entirely. Elisa Carver's body had become an apparatus of its own, no longer entirely her own. Dr. Price and Dr. Ashcroft were both aware that they were no longer tending to a conventional patient, but rather monitoring the unfolding of a multi-generational experiment materializing in real time. The veins across her abdomen had thickened and darkened, forming interlacing spirals that pulsed with a rhythm unlike any heart or vascular system ever documented. Each pulse seemed to correspond to subtle shifts in her shape, her limbs bending and twisting as though executing a preordained pattern. Medical records from the Carver lineage, brought to light by Ashcroft, revealed the meticulous design of this system. Each generation had followed a strict rotation schedule, in which each fertile woman would bear children to multiple male relatives in a precise order. These records, written in careful cursive and filled with dates and codes, detailed unions that produced offspring with predictable physical and mental traits. By the 1830s, the family's inbreeding protocol had advanced to a stage where normal definitions of kinship, parent, cousin, sibling, had all become meaningless. Eliza's condition now demonstrated the cumulative effect of generations of this manipulation. Her body was transforming in ways that could only be described as purposeful, limbs fused and unfused, twisting into angles that defied human skeletal logic. Her abdomen pulsed with a complex, almost algorithmic rhythm. Ashcroft noted in his journal that this pattern was consistent with the historical rotation charts, almost as if the child were physically enacting the centuries of calculated lineage planning. Within the womb itself, the nurses began to report auditory phenomena that made the situation even more unnerving. A faint hum seemed to emanate from her abdomen, fluctuating in pitch and intensity, sometimes synchronizing with the movement of the veins, sometimes diverging into dissonant, unearthly tones. Mrs. Red, usually unshakable in her duties, confessed to Ashcroft that the hum sounded like whispered instructions, commands that the child seemed to give to its mother's body. "It's guiding her," she said quietly. "She is following it, not knowing, but obeying." Dr. Price, ever the rational observer, recorded these events with a tremor in his hand. He recognized the danger of attributing intent to what could be biological anomaly, yet the precision, timing, and consistency of the phenomena left him no choice but to consider it. Each hour Eliza remained alive, each pulse of her veins, and each subtle rearrangement of her form reinforced the notion that the Carver lineage had not merely produced genetic irregularities. They had cultivated an intelligence, or at least a directed purpose, within the womb itself. Throughout that day Eliza's murmurs took on a distinct cadence. She recited names of ancestors long dead, speaking in tones that were almost musical, rhythmic, and hypnotic. Price and Ashcroft noted that these names matched exactly the records of unions and rotations preserved in the family journals. It was as if the child were completing a script written long before its conception, a script that required both voice and body to enact. The medical staff began to document physical anomalies with unprecedented rigor. The child's head, though still concealed within the womb, seemed to distort and elongate in ways that mirrored the rotations described in the historical records. Fingers and toes formed spiral clusters visible through the skin. The child's movements, while internal, influenced Eliza's posture, causing her to rock or twist in ways that seemed almost ritualistic. Nurses whispered that she appeared to be dancing, though there was no music, and the movements were precise rather than rhythmic in a natural sense. Ashcroft referenced these movements with the oldest Carver journals and discovered a chilling correlation. Centuries-old diagrams illustrating the rotations and unions matched almost perfectly the positions and pulsing patterns of Eliza's body. The implication was unmistakable. The child was not simply developing. It was embodying the family's centuries-long plan, manifesting generations of calculated genetic engineering through physical form. The room itself seemed to respond to these phenomena. Shadows twisted unnaturally along the walls, extending at angles inconsistent with candlelight. Instruments occasionally vibrated, as if resonating with the pulsing within Eliza's abdomen. Price recorded that the air felt dense, almost tangible, pressing against the staff in waves synchronized to the child's internal rhythm. By evening, the intensity of the contractions and pulses had grown to a near constant state. Eliza's body bore the strain visibly, her skin stretched taut over each contour, her hair falling in thin clumps, her eyes now a pale, unnatural yellow that glowed faintly in the dim light. Yet, despite her suffering, she appeared to be in a state of calm compliance, as though she understood her role in this unfolding convergence. The folio notes, later uncovered, describe the scene with clinical detachment. We are observers to a design executed over centuries. Each pulse, each twist, each breath aligns with rotations charted generations ago. The child is the apex, the lineage is complete, the pattern is manifest. We are powerless to alter it, By the morning of January 22, 1834, the infirmary had become a chamber of almost ritualistic observation. Eliza Carver's body was now entirely under the influence of the child she carried, limbs bent and curved with a precision that suggested deliberate design, and her torso shifted subtly, responding to pressures and rhythms imperceptible to the human senses. Dr. Price, usually grounded in reason, wrote in his journal that he feared he was witnessing the manifestation of an ancestral will encoded in flesh and bone. The Carver journals, previously thought to be curious but irrelevant records, now appeared to contain instructions for the very phenomena he observed. The rotation system, devised over nearly a century, had achieved its ultimate purpose. Each union, each child, each calculated pairing had culminated in a fetus that seemed aware of its lineage, capable of enforcing the family's centuries-long intentions within the maternal host. Price noted, "The child behaves as though it carries the entire Carver bloodline within itself, executing generations of purpose in its movements. The child's pulses were no longer purely biological. Each throb of the womb, each subtle twist, seemed to influence the environment. Candles flickered, instruments hummed in resonance, and the shadows cast by the staff elongated and shifted as though the room itself recognized the presence within Eliza." Nurse Red whispered that the child seemed to communicate through these movements, guiding both mother and observers in a ritual of culmination, though none could decipher its full intent. Eliza's murmurs became more pronounced and urgent. She spoke in the dialect of the Carver family, fragments of the old songs that had accompanied generations of births. The line completes. The rotations converge. The circle perfects, she whispered, her voice quivering yet calm. Price, noting the correlation, recorded that the words matched exactly the sequences detailed in the oldest family ledgers. The implication was chilling. This was no ordinary child, no random product of inbreeding. It was the embodiment of a deliberate, multi-generational design, now coming to life in the most literal sense. Observers began documenting the deformities with precision. Limbs fused at irregular angles, fingers formed spiral clusters, toes twisted unnaturally, and the abdomen seemed to contract and expand independently of Eliza's voluntary control. The veins on her skin had darkened further, almost black, forming interlocking arcs that pulsed in sync with internal activity. Price described them as vascular runes, inscribed by some unseen hand across living flesh. By midday, the child's intelligence, or at least its apparent responsiveness, was undeniable. Its movements caused Eliza to shift subtly, as though she were following instructions she could not perceive. Objects in the room appeared to respond in kind. Instruments vibrated, linens shifted, shadows lengthened, and the air itself seemed charged. Ashcroft remarked that the phenomenon had surpassed medicine and entered the realm of something ritually or spiritually engineered. The family's philosophy of genetic perfection was evident in every detail. The rotations, meticulously recorded, ensured that no genetic variation outside the family line diluted the Carver blood. Each movement of Eliza's body corresponded to patterns laid down decades earlier. Her posture, her breathing, the pulses along her veins, even the positions of her limbs, reflected the ancestral calculations. Nurse Red confessed to Price that she felt as though the girl and child were simultaneously mother, daughter, and priestess in a ceremony written centuries before. As evening approached, Eliza's distress became acute. Her body had endured days of continuous, almost mechanical strain. Price observed the signs of extreme toxicity in her physiology: rapid hair loss, teeth loosening, pallor shifting to an unnatural yellow, eyes glowing faintly. Yet, in spite of the evident suffering, she continued to obey the rhythms imposed by the child within. Each contraction, each twist, executed the centuries-old rotations with a precision no living human could sustain unaided. The room was steeped in a heavy silence, broken only by the occasional murmur from Eliza and the rhythmic hum of the child's internal movements. Price recorded the observation that the fetus seemed capable of sustaining its own processes independently of maternal input, a phenomenon he could not reconcile with contemporary knowledge of embryology. He wrote, "This child is alive, aware, and executing a plan centuries in the making, Every physiological impossibility is present, yet the system persists. By nightfall, the maternal body had become a living testament to the Carver philosophy. Every pulse, every shift, every distortion echoed the rotations, the unions, the lineage. The culmination was near. Price and Ashcroft, both exhausted, understood that the coming birth would either confirm the terrifying intelligence within the family line or end in total collapse. The air felt heavy with anticipation, as though the walls themselves awaited the culmination. The stage was set. The convergence of blood, bone, and history was nearly complete. Eliza's body, the child's movements, and the accumulated knowledge of generations had intertwined into a single, living narrative. What remained to be seen was the final manifestation, the apex of the Carver bloodline, and the revelation of what centuries of meticulous inbreeding and devotion to the perfect circle could truly produce. By January 23, 1834, the atmosphere in the infirmary had thickened into something almost tangible. Eliza Carver lay in her bed, her body contorted with the weight of generations pressing against her. Her abdomen, a tapestry of dark pulsating veins, moved with a rhythm that no ordinary human could follow. Every pulse, every shiver, seemed preordained, as though the centuries-old rotation system was being executed in real time. Dr. Price and Dr. Ashcroft had long ceased to regard her as merely a patient. She had become a vessel, a living archive of the Carver lineage, and the child within was both culmination and agent. The child's growth had accelerated in ways that defied every known principle of human development. Ultrasound rudiments, crude though they were, revealed a head disproportionately large and partially translucent, allowing glimpses of internal structures that no physician had ever documented. Organs appeared layered, interwoven, and active independently. Limbs bent at impossible angles, digits spiraled unnaturally, and tiny formations that resembled faces flickered faintly along what should have been ankles and wrists. Price, notebook trembling in hand, recorded that the child seemed aware, responsive to stimuli in ways that were almost sentient. It tracked movements with multiple sets of eyes, each seeming to observe independently, and its pulsing within the womb caused Eliza's posture to shift in precise sequences. The movements mirrored exactly the coded rotations preserved in the oldest Carver journals, a chilling confirmation that the family's centuries-long experiment was being enacted with terrifying fidelity. By mid-morning, Eliza began to experience auditory phenomena of a new intensity. She murmured ancestral names, reciting them in the archaic dialect of the Carver family. Each name corresponded to unions listed in the rotation charts. Price and Ashcroft, who had meticulously cross-referenced these records, could not ignore the implication. The child was consciously or instinctively completing a genealogical script, fulfilling the directives of generations past. The nurses noted another phenomenon. The air around the bed vibrated subtly, as if charged by the fetus's internal rhythms. Candles flickered without draft, shadows warped unnaturally along the walls, and delicate instruments on nearby tables trembled in resonance. Mrs. Red whispered to Price that it felt as though the room itself acknowledged the child's presence. "It's alive in ways we cannot understand," she said. "It moves through us, through everything here." A pain had begun to dominate Eliza's existence. Her hair fell in thick strands, teeth loosened and dropped, and her skin stretched taut over the pulsating veins, until it seemed almost transparent. Her eyes had shifted to an unnatural pale yellow, glowing faintly in the candlelight. Despite this, she remained eerily calm, obedient to the pulses within her. Price later recorded that she seemed to understand, without comprehension, that her suffering was a requirement for the fulfillment of something far larger than herself. By evening, the staff recognized a new pattern. The child's movements were now influencing the room more broadly. Instruments vibrated in response to contractions, shadows seemed to twist in deliberate shapes, and even the faint hum that had accompanied the pulses intensified into a sound that could only be described as communicative. It rose and fell in cadence with the shifting of Eliza's veins, creating an auditory map that mirrored the rotation charts. Ashcroft noted that it was as if the fetus had become the living culmination of both genetic and ritualistic legacy. Pressure reached a peak at nightfall. Eliza's body, pushed to the limits of endurance, shivered violently as if performing a final sequence. Limbs bent in spiral arcs, fingers formed precise clusters, and her torso shifted repeatedly, echoing diagrams from the oldest Carver manuscripts. The nurses, pale and silent, whispered that the mother and child were executing a ritual written in bone and blood centuries ago, one that the outside world had no comprehension of. As the night deepened, Price recorded the most disturbing observation. Eliza's body had begun to assume a geometrical order, dictated by the child's internal pulsations. Veins formed interlocking arcs resembling ancient symbols, limbs moved in repeated rotations, her torso subtly twisted in a rhythm that suggested intentional design. The fetus, by all appearances, was enforcing the culmination of the family's rotation system, converting generations of careful inbreeding into a singular, living pattern. Even the Carver family's philosophy became terrifyingly tangible. Each precise action, every twist, every contraction was a testament to the obsessive pursuit of genetic perfection. The rotation system had evolved beyond human oversight. It was now an autonomous, self-directing process encoded in flesh and enacted in real time. Price and Ashcroft, exhausted and horrified, understood that the coming birth would reveal the full extent of the Carver bloodline's ambition. This was not simply a malformed child. It was a genetic manifesto, a physical embodiment of centuries of deliberate manipulation. They could only prepare themselves to witness what would happen next, knowing that the line between human and something beyond had already blurred. The morning of January 24, 1834, arrived with a brittle silence that hung over the infirmary like a shroud. Eliza Carver's body was now a landscape of impossible anatomy, each contour and pulsation a testament to generations of methodical inbreeding. Dr. Price, having witnessed days of aberrant phenomena, noted in his journal, "I am no longer certain if I observe biology or a ritual scripted in flesh." The fetus within her seemed to command the room itself, its movements precise, measured, and unyielding. By first light, subtle changes became unmistakable. Eliza's skin had taken on a translucent, almost glass-like quality. Veins snaked across her abdomen in interlocking spirals, pulsing with a rhythm that defied natural physiology. Each pulse seemed to influence her muscles, bending them into positions that mirrored diagrams from the oldest Carver manuscripts. The fetus, despite its grotesque deformities, appeared conscious, aware, and purposeful in every movement. It was orchestrating its own birth according to instructions encoded over a century of rotations, unions, and careful genetic calculation. Observers began to notice that this was not a mere display of biological mutation. The child within Eliza seemed to manipulate space and perception. Candles flickered without draft, shadows stretched unnaturally, and instruments trembled as though alive. The nurses whispered of a faint hum that rose and fell in cadence with the pulses, a sound that suggested intelligence, even awareness, far beyond the capability of ordinary infants. Nurse Red admitted to Price that she feared the room itself was participating in the event. "It watches us," she said softly. "It moves through everything here." Eliza's murmurs became increasingly coherent, speaking in the ancient dialect of the Carver family. Names of ancestors, unions, and rotations slipped from her lips with a tremulous precision that echoed the coded instructions in the family's journals. Dr. Ashcroft, meticulously documenting every observation, realized that the child was not merely gestating. It was fulfilling a centuries-old script, executing the family's vision of perfect genetic convergence. By midday, the strain on Eliza's body was catastrophic. She had lost almost half her body weight, teeth loosened, hair fell in thick clumps, and her eyes glowed with an unnatural pale yellow luminescence. Yet she remained eerily composed, obeying the internal rhythms imposed by the fetus. Price noted that her suffering was not random. It was a requirement, an essential part of the final act. Every contortion, every pulse, every shiver was a calculation, a step in a ritual that had been encoded across generations. The birth, when it finally began, was unlike anything recorded in medical history. Eliza's body convulsed in precise, spiraling motions, limbs bending in ways that seemed physically impossible. The room itself seemed to respond. Shadows twisted into complex patterns across the walls, instruments rattled as if vibrating with recognition, and the faint hum intensified into a low, resonant chant. It became clear that the child was completing the Carver family's vision, not only through biology, but through some force that manipulated the environment itself. When the child emerged, silence fell like a heavy curtain. Its body defied every known principle of human anatomy. Limbs fused at irregular angles, digits spiraled in unnatural configurations, and formations resembling miniature faces moved along its extremities. Its skull, partially translucent, revealed a brain structured not as one organ, but as dozens of pulsing, independent lobes. Most unsettling of all were the overlapping faces, sharing features in a constant expression of silent screaming. Dr. Price, in his journal, wrote, "It is alive, it is aware, and yet it is something entirely other than human." Family members remained at the bedside, speaking in their strange dialect, offering objects and performing rituals that the staff could not comprehend. They referred to the infant as the culmination, the perfect synthesis of the Carver bloodline. It responded to them with movements suggesting recognition and even affection, but to anyone else, it was a grotesque and alien presence. Its multiple eyes tracked independently, its pulses distorted the room's very atmosphere, and every movement seemed laden with centuries of intention. As night fell, Dr. Price and Dr. Ashcroft understood that they were witnesses not merely to a birth, but to the apex of a deliberate and horrifying design. The child was the culmination of a century of calculated inbreeding, a living record of the Carver family's obsession with genetic perfection. It challenged every assumption about heredity, biology, and the limits of human tolerance. And within its movements it carried the weight of an entire lineage, executed in real time, within the body of a single, exhausted mother. The hours that followed the birth of the Carver child were filled with a tension that no one in the infirmary could dispel. Eliza lay slumped, her body spent beyond measure, her veins faintly pulsing even in death-like exhaustion. The infant, grotesque in its form yet eerily alert, remained at the center of the room like a focal point of some unseen power. Its translucent skull revealed the constantly shifting clusters of tissue within, each pulsing independently, as though it housed multiple, conscious minds. Price, Ashcroft, and the nurses exchanged glances that mixed awe and terror. They were witnessing a culmination, not just of human genetics, but of something that felt almost ritualistically sacred, though profoundly unnatural. The child did not cry. Its movements were deliberate and measured, limbs contorting in spirals that mirrored the rotation diagrams discovered in the Carver journals. Tiny formations along its ankles and wrists, grotesque in appearance, moved in patterns that suggested observation. Tiny faces turning independently, blinking and gaping in silent communication. The staff felt a strange compulsion to step back, as if the room itself demanded deference. Family members encircled the incubator. They murmured in their archaic dialect, performing rituals that had been carried across generations. Price recorded every word, though he admitted later that comprehension was nearly impossible. The syllables were structured to encode ancestral rotations, the sequence of unions, and the meticulous orchestration of the Carver lineage. Items brought from the homestead, twisted wood, patterned stones, and aged family photographs, were placed strategically around the incubator. The child responded instantly to these offerings, its body pulsing in perfect cadence, each movement a continuation of the centuries-old program. As the night deepened, the child's physiology defied explanation. Its heart did not beat in a single rhythm, but in clusters that resembled neural activity more than cardiac function. Each cluster seemed independent, sometimes synchronizing with other parts, sometimes diverging entirely. The body of the infant appeared almost modular. Arms, legs, and even sections of its torso shifted in sequences, forming geometrical patterns that suggested intention. Price and Ashcroft realized that this was not a passive organism. It was executing a deliberate blueprint encoded over decades of the Carver family's experiments. By the early hours of January 25th, it became evident that the child's influence extended beyond its body. Shadows in the room elongated unnaturally, Instruments trembled without contact, and the faint hum that had accompanied the pulses now took on tonal qualities akin to language. Low, resonant, and patterned, the medical staff could not deny that the child exerted a form of control over its environment, subtly reshaping perception, and perhaps even consciousness itself. Ashcroft wrote in his journal, "This is not merely an anomaly of genetics. This is the enactment of a living program, written in flesh, bone, and the arcane legacy of centuries." The Eliza, despite her exhaustion, continued to murmur in the family dialect. Her lips barely moved, but the words echoed with clarity in the minds of those who had spent days immersed in the phenomenon. The murmurs synchronized perfectly with the child's movements, and Price began to suspect that the mother's body and the child's were functioning as a single, unified mechanism. The rotations, previously recorded only in archaic manuscripts, were now manifest in living form, executed with terrifying precision. As dawn approached, the culmination of the rotation system became undeniable. The child began to arrange itself in positions that would have been anatomically impossible for any ordinary human infant. Limbs twisted in spirals, forming interlocking shapes, and the tiny faces along its extremities aligned in symmetrical clusters. Observers described a sensation of overwhelming inevitability, as though the child's movements were preordained by laws older than any living witness. The room itself seemed to acquiesce, the flickering light and subtle vibrations aligning with the child's final sequence. At 6:14 a.m., the child entered its final posture. Its body formed a perfect spiral within the incubator, limbs and extremities interlaced to create an intricate pattern that mirrored symbols documented in centuries-old Carver journals. 3 faces, overlapping and sharing features, appeared almost serene in their silent expression. Then, without warning, the pulsing slowed and ceased. The child was dead, leaving behind a tableau that defied understanding, a precise geometrical composition, a living blueprint of the Carver family's obsessive pursuit, now frozen in space and time. Price and Ashcroft were left with questions that would haunt them forever. The child's existence had been brief, less than 48 hours outside the womb. But in that time it had revealed the full scale of a deliberate, multi-generational experiment in genetic manipulation. Every movement, every pulse, and every contortion testified to the systematic and calculated effort of the Carver lineage. It was more than a medical anomaly. It was a living testament to centuries of obsession, secrecy, and the pursuit of an impossible ideal. The aftermath of the Carver child's death was immediate and uncompromising. Within hours, federal agents arrived in unmarked carriages and vehicles, their presence incongruous against the quiet Appalachian morning. They moved with meticulous efficiency, confiscating every possible trace of the birth, the infant, Eliza's fragile body, all medical records, and even the ritual objects brought by the family. Twisted wood, stones arranged in ancient patterns, and yellowed family photographs that recorded generations of disturbing deformities. Staff were interrogated, required to sign documents binding them to silence, and forbidden from discussing the events with anyone outside the hospital. Dr. Price recorded in his journal the weight of his unease. We were witnesses to something beyond the reach of law, beyond the reach of medicine. I am left with knowledge that cannot be shared, and a memory that refuses to fade. The official cause of death listed for both Eliza and the child was multiple congenital anomalies. Clinical, neutral, and purposefully bland. It concealed the orchestration, the decades of deliberate manipulation, and the incomprehensible scale of the Carver family's program. In the days that followed, the remaining Carvers retreated to their mountain homestead. Reports from local authorities attempting to investigate the property described a site abandoned yet preserved with eerie care. Neighbors later swore they could hear chanting or whispering on nights of fog, carried through the hollers, but no one dared approach. The family had vanished into isolation once more, carrying with them their centuries-old secrets, leaving the world only with fragments of evidence that hinted at their obsessions. Analysis of the classified reports declassified in 1984 revealed the terrifying scope of the Carver lineage. The child's DNA contained sequences that defied natural law, with alleles repeated in impossible patterns. Patterns emerged that suggested deliberate multi-generational planning, rotations and unions that produced predictable results, shaping the family over nearly a century. Every detail, from limb fusion to cranial structure, indicated purposeful design. A blueprint carried out with precision that bordered on the obsessive. The journals and records recovered from the Carver homestead told a story that even modern geneticists found difficult to comprehend. Marriages and unions were scheduled with meticulous care. Rotations of partners were tracked as rigorously as livestock breeding programs. Every child born was both a record and an experiment, each life a step toward a calculated ideal. By the time of Eliza's pregnancy, the Carver program had reached its apotheosis, a child who was no longer simply a human being, but the culmination of over a century of obsession and careful orchestration. Experts debating the case remain divided to this day. Some argue that the child's anomalies are evidence of natural extremity, pushed to impossible limits. Others insist the precision of the genetic configurations and the family's documented rotations indicate an intentional experiment spanning multiple generations. The mystery of who directed the program, and for what ultimate purpose, has never been answered. The Carvers themselves, as far as public records can confirm, disappeared into the mountains and left nothing but cryptic hints of their practices behind. Yet the story does not end with the physical death of Eliza or her child. Whispered accounts persist, both in local Appalachian communities and in the margins of medical archives. Visitors to the region report strange sounds in the night, murmurs in the fog, and fleeting glimpses of figures moving in the tree line. Some claim that the Carver program was not truly extinguished, that other isolated families may have continued rotations and experiments in ways the world is not equipped to comprehend. The moral, ethical, and scientific questions raised by the Carver lineage remain unresolved. What is the boundary between human experimentation and familial obsession? At what point does the pursuit of perfection cross into a realm where life itself is a tool? The records and remnants suggest answers that are as horrifying as they are incomplete. And so, the tale of Eliza Carver and her impossible child ends not with closure, but with a lingering, quiet dread. A shadowed warning that some human impulses, when left unchallenged and nurtured over generations, can produce results that are both unimaginable and irrevocable. Somewhere in the hollers, behind walls of mist and isolation, the echoes of the Carver family's obsession may still be alive, hidden in places where outsiders dare not venture, and where the next culmination waits in silence.